First of all, again, welcome. So glad that you're here. I'm going to be sharing the texts on the screen as well. They're going to be the same things that Julie is about to link in the chat. So if you want to look at it on a separate screen or whatever, that's fine. If you're going to be using your actual video screen where you're seeing me right now, I would recommend making your screen as large as possible. Hit the full screen or something along those lines. That way you can see the text a little bit more clearly when I see it on the screen. If you have any trouble at all, just use the links that Julie put there. It's going to be the exact same information. It's the same source sheet on either way. I also just want to take a moment to give a shout out to all of the overseas individuals that I see writing things in here. I saw Mumbai on the list. I saw Sweden on the list. Very, very honored that you would take the time to join us today. I love that we're reaching an international audience here. It just goes to show you how wonderful and universal Jewish prayer really is, at least amongst the Jewish communities of the world, but actually probably even beyond that. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully you can see me and it at the same time. And this is our second class on the Mahzor, the introduction to the Mahzor, Mahzor 101, the High Holiday Prayer Book. And for those of you that were here in our last class, last week, we focused a lot on the evening services, Erev Rosh Hashanah, Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur. Today, we're going to focus a bit more on the morning services. This is the bulk of the tefillah, the bulk of the text here is what goes on. How is this Mahzor structured? What's going on during the daytime? Now, I went through a little bit more detail on specific prayers last week because there is so much content in the morning service. We have to take a little bit of a step back, go a little bit more broad strokes. But before I get started, I just wanted to show you that what we're going to do is we're going to start with, again, a little review of what are these different mahzorim. What are the different ones we're going to see? I'm going to explain the source sheets that I have there. We're going to talk about a regular morning service, i.e. weekday or normal Shabbat versus Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, what gets added, why, where does it come from, these kinds of bits. So just a little bit from last week, because I made sure that I looked over the chat from last week. So if there's something burning that's on your mind, I really don't want you to hesitate writing it in the chat box. I will see it later. Even if I can't address it during this call, I can address it at the start of next call. I was just told that the text is a little bit fuzzy, so let me see if I can reorient this, make sure my screen is on the right screen here. Okay, and now get us back. There we go. Okay.
It's still fuzzy.
It's still a little fuzzy? Okay. It might, my tech is rebooting one of the things here. Let me just try one other thing here. I apologize in advance. We're going to see something go away. Somebody said, so is the camera feed, which means it's definitely on the Zoom end. Oh, that gave me a delay. How about now? Is it any better?
No.
No.
But we could do, we could stop the spotlight and you could do a regular screen share.
Yeah, all right, let me see if I can do a regular screen share here. Let me go back to oh, that's not the camera one that I wanted. Oh no. Okay, well, that's rebooting. Let's see what we can do here. Everything's going to be a little bit off center. I hope this doesn't mess up my screen here. Is that a little better? Can people see?
Yeah, that's much better.
That's much better there. Okay. All righty. Well, now we've got that going at least. Sorry, guys, technology. What can we do? And that's still not rebooted. Just pull this up. Technical difficulties, everyone. Okay, here we go. All right, we'll just go from here. So a little bit of notes from last week. I saw some feedback about various mahzorim that people are using. I tried my best in the 1 week time to get my hands on the requested mahzorim. I ordered a Kol HaNeshama. It has not yet arrived. As soon as I have the Kol HaNeshama, this is the Reconstructionist Mahzor, I'll make sure to add that in. I was unable to find Mahzor Ruach Chadasha. I think that's the UK Mahzor. If anybody wants to put a link in the chat box for me, I'll make sure to get my hands on one and add those into our source sheet as well, our page numbers. And I did, however, add in some Orthodox mahzorim. I added in the Koran, I added in the art scroll, and I also added in the Silverman mahzor. So those are all mahzorim that people requested last week. They're listed in blue on one of the slides that's coming up here. Now, I also mistakenly wrote last time Mishkan Tfilah for the Reform mahzor. That's their Sidur. The mahzor is called Mishkan HaNefesh, and I did edit that. So on the sheet now, it does say Mishkan HaNefesh, but even on the source sheet from last week, the page numbers corresponded to Mishkan HaNefesh, not Mishkan Tfilah. So that was actually the Reform mahzor there. And somebody made a comment asking where the Union Prayer Book has its high holiday stuff. It's in the newly revised version of the Union Prayer Book. Volume 2 is the one that's for the holidays. So just some notes for those of you that were here last week and missed some of that information. All right, what this class is going to cover today, we're going to talk about various types of mahzorim and how they're similar versus different. We're going to talk about the overall structure of the service. The art scroll is the Orthodox, is Masorah Publications. We'll talk about that in a sec. It is one of the Orthodox mahzorim is the art scroll. That's the name of the sort of brand. I don't know if it's a company or a publisher. It's their general field of texts. We're talking about the overall structure of the service. We'll talk about sections of prayer which are added to these specific holidays. We'll talk about why the mahzor is set up the way it is. We'll talk about how to navigate the mahzor. And we'll talk about some, but definitely not all, of the general terms which are relevant to the service. There's a lot that goes into the holidays. This is a 101 class. We're going to cover broad strokes. But again, if you have questions as things come up, please put them in the chat. If I don't get to it in my conversation right now, I'll definitely address it in a follow-up in next week's class. Now, just because there was a little bit of confusion last week in some of the comments here, what this class will not cover, what we will not cover is detailed information on every single blessing. There's just not enough time. We would be here for, a 6-hour class to go through every single prayer one at a time. We will not be able to go through all of the choreography, all of the sits and stands and bows and, every single tiny little thing, open the ark here, close the ark there. There's a lot of movement in the service. And we're not going to be going over specific information on melodies or tunes. And the reason for that last one is that every community has their own melodies. So there are some prayers that are staples, and you might go to a bunch of different congregations and hear roughly the same thing. But if you really want to learn how to be a leader for the holidays and learn all of those melodies and how to sing along, I would definitely recommend reaching out to somebody in your own community and asking them for a little bit of a lesson on how your community sings their particular prayers. So with that in mind, let's dive right in. These are a bunch of the mahzorim that I used to create the source sheet for this particular thing. If you see one of these on the screen and you go, oh, wait, I've got that in my bookshelf somewhere. Great, grab it, bring it over, have it nearby. These include, and I've listed these in chronological order, newest at the top, oldest at the bottom. The Mishkan Tfilah, the Koran. My Koran that I have here is actually the Hebrew-only version. There is, I believe, a Hebrew-English version of the Koran. That's not what the page numbers are in this one, but I'm not sure. Lev Shalem, Art Scroll, Kol HaNeshama, Gates of Repentance, Mahzor Chadash, Union Prayer Book, Harlow, and Silverman. Of course, the Kol HaNeshama I don't yet have page numbers for, but I'm working on that. And you can see there's a whole host of them: Reform movement, Conservative movement, Reconstructionist movement, Orthodox movement, non-denominational, but happens to be written by some conservative rabbis, right? There's so many mahzorim out there. And we talked a little bit about the history of what exactly is a mahzor and where does that word come from last week. So if that's something that interests you and you weren't here last week, by all means, I encourage you to check out that video. It's right at the start of last week's lesson. If you've got any other questions about these specific mahzorim, go ahead and put them in the chat. But we're going to dive right in here for the sake of time, because like I said, there is a lot to get through. And I know I do talk quickly, and I do apologize for that. So if at any point in time you need me to repeat something or slow down, again, that chat box is your friend. I will do my best to accommodate. And if I'm going a little bit too quick for you, I do apologize. But the good news is it's being recorded and you can always watch it again. All right. So morning services. What are they? What do they look like? What's going on here? Every morning service, doesn't matter if it's Shabbat, weekday, holiday, doesn't matter. They all follow roughly the same structure. Now I took this image here from, sorry, did I not? Mishkan, sorry, somebody wrote Mishkan HaNefesh. I apologize. This is Mishkan HaNefesh. I just wrote it wrong, but all of the page numbers are Mishkan HaNefesh. There we go. Every service is going to follow roughly the same structure. Now, I took this chart, I recreated this chart, I adapted it from a book, a series called My People's Prayer Book, Volume 9. My People's Prayer Book is an amazing series of book. If you're fascinated by where prayer comes from and what's going on with it, it's a 10-book series that goes over literally everything you could possibly ever need to know about our regular prayers, except it doesn't cover the high holidays. But it does cover our weekday and Shabbat stuff. It's really, really great. My People's Prayer Book. But we're going to start the same way. We begin with our morning blessings. We move to, which are often called Birkot HaShachar, which literally means the morning blessings. Rabbis aren't very creative at naming things. We just kind of say what it is, right? We're going to do morning blessings. What should we call it? But the morning blessings. There we are. We move into Psukei de Zimra, which literally means verses of song, right? So these are scriptural verses, usually, mostly Psalms. Psukei, pasuk, is a verse. And so we got our warm-up Psalms. Then we move to the Shema and its blessings. There are 2 blessings before the Shema, 1 after. And I'll take a moment here to note, and I'll say this again later as well, when we say the word blessing in Hebrew, in regards to tefillah, in regards to prayer, we mean something very specific. We mean the words Baruch Atah Adonai. If it doesn't have the words Baruch Atah Adonai, it's not a blessing. It might be a prayer. It might be a song. It might be a poem. It might be a thank you to God. It might be a whole host of things. But when we say the word blessing, we mean the words Baruch Atah Adonai. So there are 2 Baruch Atah Adonais before the Shema and 1 Baruch Atah after the Shema that we constitute as this section of Shema and its blessings. We then move into the Amidah, our standing blessings. Then, if it is a Monday, Thursday, Shabbat, or holiday, we add in a Torah reading. And then if it's a holiday, we add in Musaf. This, a Shabbat or a holiday, we add in Musaf, our additional service. And then we have a little bit of a conclusion. And this is just your very standard arc of service. Weekday, Shabbat, holiday, doesn't matter, all falls into roughly this same arc. Now, the one other thing I will note about this arc before I move on to the next slide, and let's see if I can actually get my, do I have the ability to annotate, Julie? Is that a thing here? Maybe not. That's okay. I'll use my mouse. We can see my mouse, right? Right, my mouse on the screen. Okay, great. So Birkot HaShachar and Psukei de Zimra are very often mislabeled, either intentionally or unintentionally, as the same thing. So very often we'll use those words interchangeably. So somebody might say, oh, let's do Birkot HaShachar, and what really they mean is this whole section. Or they'll say, hey, let's do Psukei, or what they mean is this whole thing. So there is a technical distinction between Birkot HaShachar and Psukei de Zimra, one of which being that Psukei de Zimra are actual text. These are scripture in Psukei de Zimra. But these words colloquially are very, very interchangeable. People are just referring to the morning stuff, the intro level things. And what's really nice about the high holidays is that you and I right now in this conversation can actually pretty much ignore Birkot HaShachar and Psukei de Zimra, because for the high holidays, there's really nothing different. There's really not. Your Mahzor might have a bunch of extra meditations in there. They might have special readings. They might have poems. Your congregational rabbi might say, I'm not going to do it from the Mahzor at all. I've got this other reading that I brought in that it's really spoke to me this year. And it's all just intro things. And the reason why there's not as much distinction in Birkot HaShachar and Psuke de Zimra, why it's a little bit more fluid, and in our page numbers, so in this sheet that you have as one of your source sheets is the page numbers, I've only listed a couple of prayers under Birkot HaShachar and Psuke de Zimra. And the reason for that is because it's just too variable in any given Mahzor. I would need 10 pages to list out everything that's in every one of these Mahzors for these two sections. They're very, very, very generic sort of intro stuff. And the reason for that is because they didn't used to be done in services. These used to be sections that we did on our own at home. And so when the Gemara, when the Talmud talks about Birkot HaShachar and Psuke de Zimra, they're talking about individual personal prayers. It's not until the main part of the service that we actually start having the communal prayers where you need the minyan, where you need 10 Jewish adults in order to say them. These are prayers like Kaddish, Baruch, Amidah, etc. And so for the holidays, there was never really any focus on sort of elaborating on these because no one was really expecting to do them all together. It wasn't until later when in the diaspora, the rabbi said, listen, we don't think people are going to do Birkot HaShachar by themselves at home. Let's just do it all together in shul. And they gave you an opportunity. They said, come to shul earlier and we'll do it all together. And they call it a day. So really the main differences that we're going to see are going to start with the Shema and its blessings here. And here we are. Really, it's going to start with the Amidah, actually. The Shema and its blessings are, I should have also mentioned, are pretty much the same. Those are pretty universal. There are going to be some extra inserts for the Shema and the Baruch Hu. So Baruch Hu might be a little bit longer. It's got, for example, we start the Baruch Hu with the words Hamelech, but just before the Baruch Hu, we have these words Hamelech. And in a normal Shabbat, that's just, it's I don't want to say a throwaway line, but like it's just part of the paragraph. But then on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we make it really big. Hamelech, the King, right? We're really emphasizing God. But that's not actually a difference in Mahzor. That's not a difference in prayer. That's a difference in the way we present the prayer. And so it's always nice if you're familiar with Shabbat and weekday services to kind of look and see, wait, am I being tricked here by melody? Is there something actually different that we're saying? Or are we just saying it in a different way? But where we're actually going to start seeing something different is the Amidah. The Amidah is the moment that traditionally we think of as really speaking directly to God. And so there's a couple things, and we're going to go a little bit more in depth in it, but basically we're going to add some piyutim, and piyutim are liturgical poems. We gave a little bit more of the history of piyutim last week. So again, I want to encourage a visit to that video if you don't remember it or if you weren't here. But piyutim are non-scriptural liturgical songs. So they're designed to be prayer. They're designed to talk to God, but they're not from scripture. They're not from Bible. So we're going to add some of those in the Amidah. Now, which ones we add are up to the particular Mahzor. In our page numbers, I've listed the common ones that you will likely see regardless of what Mahzor you're looking at. There are some staples that have just sort of grown in popularity over the years. So I've listed those. But you'll notice in your Mahzor, there might be 10, 20, 30 more that I didn't list, depending on which Mahzor you're using. And that's because these are chosen by the editor. There's nothing obligatory about which piyutim we use. They each have their own messages. And so the editors and the rabbis chose to put in what they like. And some congregational rabbis throw the book out the window and they say, I'm going to bring some other ones. And here's a handout, or I'm not going to give you anything to follow along and just listen to the chazan. So everyone does it sort of in their own way. But there's always going to be some piyutim added into the Amidah. Then there's going to be a specific insert in the fourth prayer for Rosh Hashanah. One that acknowledges that we're at Rosh Hashanah and not any other day of the year. And then we're going to end the Amidah with Avinu Malkeinu. When we get to the Torah reading, we're going to also add in the 13 attributes. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum Vechanun, right? That's our 13 attributes, the 13 acknowledgments of God's personality. And then on Rosh Hashanah only, this is why it's in blue, on Rosh Hashanah only, not Yom Kippur, we're going to add in shofar into the Torah service here a little bit. There is no shofar on Yom Kippur. And all shofar blowers on the planet are very grateful for that fact, because I could not imagine trying to do 100 blasts of the shofar while fasting. Though one at the very end of Yom Kippur is hard enough, but we'll talk about that. Then in Musaf, which is our additional service at the very end, we're going to add in this Hineni prayer, which we'll talk a little bit about. This Unatana Tokef is technically a piyut, but it's a specific one that has kind of grown in popularity. We're going to add in some additional piyutim, and then again on Rosh Hashanah, some shofar. And then we're going to have a conclusion. And you'll notice the conclusion's in blue because, as we're going to see in a second, we actually don't have a conclusion in the Mahzor for any of Yom Kippur's morning service, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, there's also this added thing that I put down here, which is Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. Traditionally speaking, we would stick these in Musaf. It's actually in the middle of Musaf, and these are 3 additional blessings, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. And in many mahzorim, they have them listed there. However, the reason I have them off to the side is because some of the more modern movements, the Reform movement, for example, you'll notice that on your source sheet, they don't include the Musaf service at all. And so the Mahzor has to stick this Malchuyot, Zichronot, Shofarot somewhere else in the Mahzor. So traditionally we would have it as part of the Musaf, but if your congregation doesn't do Musaf, then those are going to have to come in elsewhere. So those are additions to Rosh Hashanah. And one of the reasons why Rosh Hashanah actually becomes such a much longer service than everything else. You'll notice that all of the other additions are fairly short. Now, the one additional thing that I wrote down here is Psalm 27. Psalm 27 is a psalm that we say all during the month of Elul, going all the way through Yom Kippur, and some people even do it all the way through Sukkot. However, what I noticed looking at all the different mahzorim is that some of them put it in the morning blessings, some of them put it at the end, some of them stick it somewhere in the middle. There's no real regulation on where people say Psalm 27. So that might be an extra addition you might find in your Mahzor somewhere, is Psalm 27. That's Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur, very similar, slight differences. Amidah is the same. We add in piyutim, an insert obviously for Yom Kippur, not Rosh Hashanah, and with Avinu Malkeinu. Torah reading, we have the 13 attributes, no shofar. Musaf, we still have the Hineni, Unatana Tokef, and piyutim. Still have Psalm 27 somewhere in there. In Yom Kippur, however, there's no conclusion. There's no Kaddish Shalem, Ein Keloheinu, Mourner's Kaddish at the very end, Adon Olam, any of the stuff you're used to at the end of a morning service won't be there on Yom Kippur. To be perfectly transparent, I have no idea why. I tried looking, but isn't that refreshing to hear a rabbi say, But I have 2 guesses, because like rabbis are also experienced in the art of like, I don't know, come up with something, right? Midrash is a fun thing. So I have 2 theories, but I want to be really transparent. These are my theories. I don't know. I really don't know. My 2 theories, good. Ne'ilah is a conclusion. I'm referring only to the morning part of our day. We're going to talk about Ne'ilah and the evening ending service in our last class next week. So when I'm talking about the morning conclusion, I mean Adon Olam, Ein Keloheinu, those kinds of conclusion prayers. But yes, Ne'ilah is a conclusion. It will end Yom Kippur. We won't let it go on forever. We will end it, but not until later. That's next week's class. So my 2 theories on this are, if you notice in most mahzorim, on Yom Kippur, the very next page after Musaf is Mincha. It goes straight into the afternoon service. So my one thought is that it's very possible that for many congregations, especially traditionally, the morning service would have taken so long that you literally wouldn't have left. You just stay there and go to the afternoon service and keep going. My second thought is in that same notion, but more sort of metaphysical and spiritual than reality, which is that a lot of people on Yom Kippur will go into a text study, or they'll stay at the synagogue, or they'll just kind of hang out, or they'll take a nap, anything to kind of not think about the fast. And so by not having a conclusion, we kind of remind ourselves that like the day's not over, right? We got to come back. We need to come back for Ne'ilah and the last shofar blast, and end Yom Kippur properly. But again, those are my guesses. What we're going to notice in the Mahzor, though, since this is a class about the Mahzor, is that the Mahzor does not have any of those concluding prayers at the end of Yom Kippur, the way that it does at the end of Rosh Hashanah morning. Let's see, Adon Olam for Ma'ariv. For Ma'ariv of what day? We're looking at the Shacharit. So if you've got my page numbers here, we're looking at today's class. We're talking about page 6 through the end. So pages 1 through 5 are last week's source sheet. That's the evening. That's Erev. That's the day before Rosh Hashanah and the night before Yom Kippur. That's 1 through 5. These charts that I'm showing right here, these are available on that second, on the non-page number source sheet. These slides are available. These charts are available. Now, the last thing that we add in on Yom Kippur here, on Yom Kippur, it says page 126. 126 on Mishkan Tefillah. Yeah, so yes, Mishkan HaNefesh, that's Erev Yom Kippur on page 126. That's finishing up the night before Yom Kippur, not the morning. So that's the evening before we start. Okay. So we're looking at page 6 through the end. 6 through the end is what we're looking for on the newer source sheets here. Now, the last thing that we add in on Yom Kippur are 3 additional services, not prayers, services. There's the Yizkor service, the Avodah service, and the Martyrology service. And we're going to talk about what each of those are in just a minute here. But the reason they're at the bottom is that almost every Mahzor has these put in a different place, put in a different order. Some of them exclude some of it altogether. There's dramatic variation on this. Many congregations that I've been a part of don't even use the Mahzor for some of these services. They actually make their own packets, and they hand out additional packets and services for these 3 sections. So as far as the Mahzor is concerned, these are sort of 3 separated out pieces that will be done somewhere on Yom Kippur. And some congregations actually omit some of these entirely. And we'll talk about that when we go into a little bit more detail in just a minute. There is a request for my color coding here. Yes, I apologize for that. Orange means it's new, it's specific to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So in both of these charts, if it's in orange, it's going to be on both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. If it's in blue, it's specific to that day. So this here, the title says Rosh Hashanah additions. The blue are just Rosh Hashanah, not Yom Kippur. The slide that says Yom Kippur additions, the blue are just Yom Kippur, not Rosh Hashanah. So hopefully that helps. So let's go through it. Now that we know what's going to be added, what is in our service? Birkot HaShachar. I mentioned earlier that sometimes these words are kind of mixed up with Pesukei Zimra. Technically speaking, Birkot HaShachar are all of the morning stuff. This is putting on the talit. This is, there's a section that goes Baruch Atah Adonai, da 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 da, Baruch Atah Adonai, Baruch Atah Adonai, Baruch Atah Adonai, all in subsequent order. These are our morning blessings. Thank you, God, for giving sight to the blind, for clothing the naked, for making me a Jew, for making me in your image, for making me free. All of these additional individualized prayers. These are the ones we used to say at home by ourselves. Oftentimes, there's a bit of Torah study that's put inside Birkot HaShachar, which would then give us a Kaddish D'Rabbanan, one of the Kaddishes that we say after doing Torah study. Others will just have a mourner's Kaddish at the end of Birkot HaShachar. Depends on your custom of your synagogue. Pesukei Zimra starts right around Baruch She'amar. Baruch she'amar v'haya olam, the Ashrei. It's got a bunch of psalms in it that we'll use, the Hallelujah prayers. That's all part of Psuke de Zimra, Az Yashir, if you like that one. All scripturally based sections of Torah and all the stuff that we do in the morning. So again, I'm going over that really fast because it's the same as all of the other rest of the year, except your Mahzor might have some extra stuff that are specific to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, that those editors chose to put in, or that your rabbi or cantor chooses to put in. But generally speaking, they're roughly the same. And then again, the Shema and its blessings I mentioned here. So we can see in my Mahzor, if you can see my page, the Hamelech is like nice and big there, right at the top. Hamelech, and you can ignore the pencil. That's just my little chicken scratch reminding me of how I'm supposed to sing it according to my melodies, which might not be the same as your melodies, though they're probably similar. But in reality, the prayer is the same. The words are the same as they are throughout the rest of the year. Yishtabach, Baruchu, Ahava Rabbah, right? It's all the same stuff. Now, what I will point out is on our page numbers here, when you get to the Shema itself, the 3 paragraphs of the Shema, I'll also point out that some mahzorim have special inserts in them in case Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur falls on a Shabbat. Not all of them do. Some of them just ignore the Shabbat stuff and just say, we're not going to do that even if it's Shabbat. Others put some in, so you might see some extra stuff on that page number handout. Additionally, when we get to the Shema itself, the Shema has 3 paragraphs from 3 different places in Torah. One we call Ve'ahavta, right? Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. The second paragraph is V'haya'im Shemoa. And that paragraph talks all about if we follow the commandments and we do good things, God will keep the world turning. And if we ignore God and become horrible people and don't care about the world around us, things aren't going to work out so well. And a lot of mahzorim, a lot of sidurim, a lot of movements have actually removed that paragraph from their daily liturgy. Others, like the Mishkan HaNefesh, actually give you options. They put it in one section and then don't put it in another. So you can choose on the high holidays whether or not you want to say it or not. Similarly with the third paragraph, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe Lemor, talks all about the tzitzit that we wear every single day. Some more modern movements don't wear tzitzit every day, and so that paragraph has been sort of removed from that as well. So depending on your mahzor, and even when you look on my sheet, you might say, well, that's weird. Why are some paragraphs of the Shema missing? That's a conscious decision by the editors of those mahzorim. Thank you. Yes, somebody said in the chat here that they have a special booklet each year for Yizkor. A lot of congregations do that. They put out a special Yizkor booklet. And shout out to Temple Emmanuel in Denver, actually. I'm familiar with your shul. I've been there a number of times. Lovely community. And then intro to the Amidah, the Micha Mocha, right, getting ready. There's some additional things that might be put in there, etc. But generally speaking, up to this point is roughly the same as any other part of the service. So let's get into the Amidah, because the Amidah is the first part where we see a big distinction. Now, normally during the weekday, the Amidah has 19 blessings in it total. It's got 7 blessings on Shabbat and holidays. The middle section of the Amidah is asking God to do things. It's asking God to do some work. And just like we're resting because God's resting, we acknowledge that God is resting on these holidays. So we take out that middle section and we insert just one blessing all about the specific day. And again, a reminder, blessing equals Baruch Atah Adonai. If you're trying to count them in the Sidur or in the Mahzor, look for Baruch Atah Adonai. That's how you know you've ended Baruch Atah Adonai. So the first one, Avot v'imahot, all about our ancestors, right? Our relationship, God's relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or depending on your Mahzor, also Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Second paragraph, Gvurot, all about God's powers. It's maybe worth mentioning that some Mahzorim still have high holiday piyutim, even in Shema uvirchoteha. Oh, yes. So some mahzor, yes, thank you for that. So some mahzorim will have additional piyutim spread out all throughout the beginning part of the mahzor, right? So when I say we're adding in piyutim starting in the Amidah, that's not exclusively in the Amidah. Thank you for that correction. Some mahzorim, depending on how they're structured, will put it all the way through, sort of intertwined everywhere. So again, you got to check your mahzor for what is additionally in there. I did not put in every single possible thing on every single possible mahzor in our page number sheet. But the popular ones, the ones that everyone's familiar with, I tried to put on the sheet, the ones that were kind of in every mahzor across the pantheon there. The third blessing, Kedushat Hashem, right? This is our Kedusha. This is our Nikadesha Chimcha Ba'olam, our Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. When we go up on our toes, that whole thing talks about the sanctity of God, right? Acknowledging God's holiness. Now, these three prayers, these three blessings are roughly the same throughout the year. Not 100%. There are some added inserts for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but roughly the same. Similarly, our last three, 5 through 7 here, Avodah, all about the temple service. This is our Ritzei paragraph. Hoda'ah, Modim Anachnu Lach, we're thankful to God. And Sim Shalom or Shalom Rav, right, are asking God for peace. These are roughly the same year round. Again, little differences here and there, some inserts, things like that, but roughly the same. Where we get our big distinction, is in Kedushat Hayom, in the 4th paragraph. This is the center of our Amidah. And in this prayer, in this blessing, is where we're going to have a major difference in what appears Rosh Hashanah versus Yom Kippur. Oftentimes, piyutim are added between the 2nd and the 3rd. So after the givurot, you'll notice that in the sheet in our page numbers, there's some added piyutim in here. After those, commonly Adonai Melech, right? Adonai Melech, Adonai Malach, Adonai Imloch Leolam Vaed. Also Le'el Orech Din. I guarantee you all have different melodies for that one. The one I like is da 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 dum ya da da dum ya da 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 dum. But again, not a melody class. Otherwise, our big shift is really going to be in the 4th blessing. Now, on Yom Kippur, on Rosh Hashanah, this is where we're probably going to have our Malchuyot, Zichronot, Shofarot in the Musaf, not in the initial Amidah, but in the Musaf. On Yom Kippur, we will add in piyutim as well as a slichot section. Slichot are prayers that are asking God for forgiveness. This is our Ashamnu, Al-Chet, all of the moments where we're beating our chest. On Yom Kippur, we'll add those in oftentimes into the Amidah here as well, both in the silent Amidah and the repetition of the Amidah. Regardless, that's one thing to look out for in your Mahzor here. And then, of course, we close out on the holidays with Avinu Malkeinu. That sort of ends our Amidah section here. When we get to Musaf, we're going to go into those other additional sections, Slichot and the Malchuyot, Zichronot. We're going to go a little bit more into that when we get to Musaf. But after that becomes our Torah section. Now, I put this at the top of my arc. Somebody actually noted that when they saw my little outline in the beginning on those early slides. I put that at the arc because I believe that the Torah reading is really why we're there. That Torah is sort of this moment of prayer where we're hearing our history, right? There is no Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur without the Torah that told us to have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There is no Jewish history without the stories of our ancestors. There is no mitzvot. There are no mitzvot without the Torah saying this is the foundation on which you should live your lives, right? There is no monotheology without Abraham Avinu saying, wow, look at this relationship I have with God. Right? So for me, I put at the top of my arc, I believe that's like a really incredible, wonderful moment to really sort of get at the heart of everything that we're saying in prayer. Others will view the top of their chart as the Amidah, or they'll kind of put that, in line with one another. That's just my own personal editing. That's my own theology. We can have a whole other class on that where I preach to you, but that's not today. Today, we're going over the Mahzor. But yes, in my ideal world, man, Torah, Torah, Torah. Let's get some, we should know what's happening in the Torah. Let's emphasize that. Bring that back to your rabbi. Rabbi Feivel said we should emphasize more Torah. You can quote me on that one. I love it. All right. So what happens in our Torah reading? On Rosh Hashanah, we include, in addition to having just Torah that's relevant to the holidays, on Rosh Hashanah, we include the sounding of the shofar. This is the first sort of moment where we're really blowing the shofar. And the goal, according to the Talmud, is to have 100 shofar blasts throughout Rosh Hashanah. So some communities take that very literally. And in the Mahzor, you will see all throughout Rosh Hashanah, shofar blowing in the Torah reading, shofar blowing in the silent Amidah, though some communities actually say, no, don't do it during the silent Amidah, just do it during the repetition of the Amidah. So that might be different in your Mahzor. You'll see it in Musaf. You'll see it at the end. You'll see large sections, small sections. Some mahzorim will take that very, very seriously, and they'll get in that 100. Other communities say, listen, that's a lovely goal, but we'll do some shofar. All right, and they call it a day. So you can check with your, listen out for it. See if you can count this year. That's your challenge this year. How many shofar blasts did you hear? But the Talmud says have 100 blasts. We won't do that on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, the only day of shofar, the only moment of shofar is at the very end, right before the break fast. We read we blow one big long Tekiah Gedolah at the end, and it's always shorter than the Rosh Hashanah Tekiah Gedolah. Be nice to your shofar blowers. It's the end of a fast. They don't have as much energy. It's okay. It doesn't have to be 3 minutes long. They're doing their best. But they will blast that at the end of Yom Kippur just to signal that Yom Kippur is now done. What do we read on the holidays? Really, really great question. I also did not specify that because different mahzorim have alternate Torah readings. Generally speaking, we have the Akedah, we have bits about the relationship between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and God. We have Haftarah from the book of Jonah. There's some staples that are generically there, but especially in recent days, there have been alternate Torah readings put in. But I put the page numbers for where the Torah reading can be found in your Mahzor. So if you turn to those page numbers, you can see what section of Torah your Mahzor is using. But really great question. What do we actually, Torah reading do we actually read? Now, on Yom Kippur, some communities and some mahzorim have this be their point of Yizkor. So we would take out the Torah, read the Torah, but before we put it away, have Yizkor, have our memorial service. Other communities don't. They do it at a different point in the service. So for many of the mahzorim, this is where Yizkor lands in the Mahzor. So even if your community does it at a different time, your rabbi or your cantor might say, go back to page whatever, because now we're going to do Yizkor. But that's why the mahzorim have it in this location, as many communities traditionally will do it here, so that the Torah can still be out for that service. Which then, of course, after our Torah, brings us to Musaf. Now, the word Musaf comes from the word additional. It means the additional service. We get the idea of the Musaf service, this additional service, based on in Numbers chapter 28 and 29, which talks about this additional sacrifice at the temple. And so it's this added sacrifice on Shabbat and holidays that we are referencing. Numbers chapter 28, by the way, is Parshat Pinchas. If you ever want to learn, to start to learn how to read Torah, I recommend starting with there because we read it throughout the year more often than any other section of Torah. So it's a good starter chapter is Numbers chapter 28. But we get it from this idea that once upon a time, we brought in this additional sacrifice. And so we have this additional prayer that pops up on Shabbat and holidays. As I mentioned before, many Reformed congregations omit this entirely. And so all the sections we're going to look at, they sort of place throughout their Mahzor in various other locations, some of them infused in their initial Amidah, some of them just otherwise in random spots. So on the source sheet, this is where my page number actually gets a little confusing. If you're using one of the Reform Sidurim, you actually have to look ahead at my page numbers about Musaf to find where these things are in your prayer book. It's not in the right order according to the Reform mahzorim. The reason for that is I couldn't create 20 different pages for each mahzor. So there's a little bit of flipping on that one for the Reform communities. Now, the Musaf will open with this big section called Hineni. Hineni means here I am. It's the response that Abraham gives to God when God says, Abraham, where are you? Or it calls out Abraham, and Abraham says, Hineni, I'm right here. It's a spiritual word. It's not just like, here I am physically in this room. It's like, I am here with you. I'm in this moment. And some communities will sing this at the start of the Musaf. Others will do it after the silent Amidah. So different mahzorim have it in different locations there. But what this is this is the chazan, the service leader, the cantor, their time to say to God, listen, I'm about to ask, is there a female version of Hineni? Hineni is in the singular. I shouldn't be so gendered, but okay, I'll have to look more into that. I don't know. I'm not familiar with that one. But Hineni basically says, I was asked by this community to come lead in these prayers of forgiveness, but I myself am not actually worthy of standing here. I'm not special. There's nothing special about me, the service leader, that should say, oh, you should listen to my voice over everyone else. So I'm standing here before you, God, as a representative for this community, and I hope that my own misdoings don't cause you to misjudge the rest of the community. That's what the Hineni prayer is about. And some communities make this a big pomp and circumstance. I've seen rabbis and cantors walk in from the back of the room in synchronization. I've seen large, big musical numbers. It's fanfare. It's this whole thing. Personally, I find that a little bit odd, right? To say, look, I'm so humble, and then look at me, look at me, look at me, I'm so humble, and it's this big open thing. So some communities make it this big thing. Others make it very, very, very minimal, right? It really depends on what your community is doing with Hineni, but that's what that prayer is really about. So some people start it at the very beginning of Musaf before anything else. Others wait until the actual repetition of the Amidah to say, like, I'm literally about to say things out loud to God. Here I am with the Hineni, and they start it that way. Unatana Tokef, this big section, this big piyut, starts after the second blessing. You get some more piyutim after the third blessing, but again, the big difference is in that fourth blessing, the prayer for the specific day. So on Rosh Hashanah, you have Malchuyot, Zichronot, Shofarot. In Yom Kippur, you have Slichot, and some people will include Avodah and Martyrology. So what are these? Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofar are technically 3 new blessings. So technically on Rosh Hashanah, we have 9 blessings total, and not 7. Malchuyot is all about the sovereignty of God, God as king. This is where we have the great Aleinu, the big Aleinu, where we bow all the way down to the ground. And that's our big Aleinu. It was actually originally written just for here. Originally, according to the Gemara, according to the Talmud, Rosh Hashanah is the only time of the whole year we actually say Aleinu. Adding it into our regular services actually came way later in sort of our history of how the Sidur evolved, and mostly because people loved it so much on Rosh Hashanah. But really, this is where it was written for. It was this moment of saying, wow, God is king. Then it has some verses from Tanakh, from Torah, prophets, and writings, all about God's sovereignty, and then some shofar. The Zichronot is all about remembrance. The scripture here talks about God remembering God's relationship with the Jewish people, right? And then shofar. Shofarot, as the name implies, has verses from scripture, Torah, prophets, and writings that all reference the power of the shofar and the fact that the shofar symbolizes God's sovereignty, not only God's sovereignty, but also sacredness. And then, of course, shofar. And that's the structure for the Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot, is that we've got intro, verses, shofar. And that goes on repeat for these 3 sections. On Yom Kippur, Yizkor, now again, sometimes done during Torah, sometimes elsewhere. Avodah and Martyrology, sometimes done during Musaf, sometimes done elsewhere. Yizkor is our memorial service. This is the service in which we acknowledge those who have died. These are our loved ones, our personal loved ones. Who do we want to remember this holiday season? Typically, there's an intro, there's the Yizkor blessing. Some mahzorim have a lot of options. Some only have a few options. Some will say for a man, for a woman, for a father, for a mother, for a child, for a spouse, for a partner, they've got lots of different options, and they all start with the word Yizkor, right? May we remember. There's often an El Malei Rachamim. Sorry, repeat the 3 again. Thank you so much. For Malchuyot, Zichronot, Shofarot, we have intro, scripture, shofar. Intro, scripture, shofar. Torah, prophets, and writing all make their way into that section of the service. Yizkor often has an El Malei Rachamim, asking God to grant peace to those who have passed away. And then oftentimes, though I notice not in every Mahzor, there's a mourner's Kaddish. The Avodah service and the Martyrology are often removed from many congregations, especially Reform, Reconstructionist, and even many conservative congregations omit Avodah and Martyrology altogether. The Avodah service itself references the worship service of the temple, sort of calls back to this idea of being, oops, my camera just turned itself off. No worries, you can still see my screen share here. Refers to this idea of let's all go back to the temple, right? Let's this sort of return to temple days. And in movements that don't really look forward to a third temple or don't really care about that sort of theological implication, we'll just kind of omit this altogether. Often the Avodah service will include slichot, prayers for forgiveness, as well as the priestly blessing, because this is really the priestly service. That's another name for it, is the priestly service. Communities that have a lot of Kohanim usually really like this service because it gives their Kohanim an added opportunity to actually get up and have a role in the service. This is where we'd see what we call duchening. This is where the if your community does it, where the Kohanim will come up and they'll spread their fingers like Spock. Fun fact, Spock actually gets that. Leonard Nimoy actually chose that because of the priestly blessing. Leonard Nimoy, who was a member of Congregation Adat Shalom in Los Angeles once upon a time, Zichrono Livracha. And then we have the Martyrology, otherwise known as Eila Ezkara. Eila Ezkara means these I will remember. And what this is this is literally the service of the Martyrology. It will often have sections referencing mass, either mass death from Jews or individuals who were actually martyrs in their own right. Rabbi Akiva, the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Holocaust, the War of Independence for Israel, moments throughout Jewish history where people died for Judaism. Again, some communities choose not to emphasize the notion of dying for your religion and will remove this altogether. Others find this to be an incredibly meaningful and powerful part of the service, and they leave it in. But in terms of the Mahzor, in terms of the book that we're looking at today, you'll find these sections in wildly different places depending on where you're looking. Some Mahzorim have them in the Musaf, some have them as their own sections at the very end, some are very truncated and short, some are 20, 30, 40 pages long. You can actually learn a bit about what did the editor think of these services based on how they represent it in the book itself. But most Mahzorim will have them somewhere. Oh, thank you. Somebody wrote the female Hinani is on the left-hand side of Rosh Hashanah on page 140, and again on Yom Kippur on page 312. Is that the Lev Shalem? I see some nodding on the Lev Shalem. Wonderful. That's great. I will acknowledge my own male privilege here and say that I was not even aware that was one of the sections that was a point of contention. And I'm glad that somebody noticed it was and has done something about it and put that in at least one mahzor. I'll go on the record saying that makes me very happy, and also acknowledge that I have some more growth to do on my own in terms of acknowledging my own male privilege there when it comes to the holidays and our tradition. Because yes, for many, many generations, it has been a very, very gendered opportunity for leaders, and it's time that we adjust that. Of course, if your community is on the more traditional side and women actively do not take a role in the service, that's another story altogether. But for those movements that are egalitarian and want to strive for that, we need to be representing that in our mahzorim as well. So thank you for pointing that out. And thank you to whoever asked the question earlier. All right. Finally, we have our conclusion right as we're wrapping up our time here. On both days, we have Kaddish Shalem. On Rosh Hashanah only, we have the Ein Keloheinu Aleinu Mourner's Kaddish, Psalm 27. Again, if it's there, it might not be there. It might be at the beginning. And then our Adon Olam Yigdal to end up our morning service on Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur does not have these in the mahzor. Does that mean your specific community doesn't ever do them? I don't know. I'm not at your specific community. They might, but it won't be in the mahzor that I have, at least was any of the mahzorim that I found that are on my page number sheet here. And that is going to actually wrap up our Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur morning service. I know there was a lot of stuff in there, and that was so general. And I wish we could just like dive super deep into every single page of everything. And if you want that, reach out to me. My email and website is on the screen, freelancejudaism.com. This is what I do. I love teaching. It brings me with so much joy to get to learn with all of you. I hope you learned at least something new. And stay tuned for next week, where we're going to finish up our Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services with the evening parts of our day, the end of Rosh Hashanah, the end of Yom Kippur. And a huge thank you to Julie and My Jewish Learning for bringing me in and helping me and hosting this program for us.